This is Module 2 of F.I.R.E teaching. I'm Gary Damore.
And I'm Linnea Lyding.
We're going to talk about why we write objectives. And if you recall from the first module, we talked about kind of the whole, the big picture of all of the various elements. And this is the first part of that of those elements. This first element is the learning objective. And you can see we're going to be talking not only about the learning objective, but communicating why it's so important to communicate the learning objective.
Yeah, and as you can see, that engagement thread is still there, going through the whole thing. Starts with the objective. So, first question, it was the first question on the true-false, although I'm going to tell you they're not in order, but the brain is designed to forget things. What do you think? Is it true or is it false? What do you think? Well, the answer is it is true. In fact, the brain produces almost 70,000 thoughts a day. So you can imagine 70,000 thoughts, you can't remember all of those things. So it has to be selective, it has to make a choice. And so you want to try and give your students a heads up on, hey, this is something to pay attention to. Your brain needs to know this is something to pay attention to. So there's scientific reason to talk about the objective.
You know, if you think about driving down the street any given day, there is so much input that's coming your way. There are signs everywhere, pedestrians, there are street lights, and there's just so much information coming at you. And if your brain didn't selectively put some of those things away and aside, and if you're driving down the street, you've probably thought, gosh, I don't even remember going by a particular business or something. Because your brain is designed really to say, what is the purpose right now? Well, my purpose is to drive, and I have a destination, and that's where I'm going. And so a lesson is very much like that. Students will come into your classroom and they have lots going on in their lives. They have a lot of data from their that's coming in from their cell phones and that sort of thing, from conversations they just came from. And they have a lot of input. And what you're trying to do is to get them to focus on what the input is that you are going to be giving them in your lesson.
At the end of this lesson today, you're going to be able to explain why it's essential that you write an objective and identify different ways that you can communicate that objective to your students.
And you've heard me say this before, and I'll say it repeatedly, which is also a good technique. Remember, you need to repeat things multiple times. But it's so critical. I mean, when you talk about the engagement thread, the part where you engage your students on the objectives is communicating it to them and getting them to understand, this is where I'm going today. I know where I'm going. And so that's the objective part, is communicating it is really critical. It's not enough for you to know where you're going. You want your students to know where you're going with your lesson as well. And we have some research to back this up too. This is not just a personal preference, but there's
right,
this is
right.
really
So
important.
Dr. Schmoker has a book called Results Now, and he says it's one of the most effective strategies. The research has shown it's one of the most effective strategies for student achievement.
You know, and I'm going to go as far as to say this. I don't recommend that you only watch this module and that you only apply this element. I want you to apply as many elements as possible as you can in all of your teaching. But if you do one, this is the one thing that you should do. And I will tell you, as an administrator, we actually brought Mike Schmoker here on campus. Linnea and I brought him around, walked into various classrooms. It was rare for us to see people communicating their objective to their students. It's the easiest thing you can do to get better performance out of your students, and it's so often neglected. People just dive into teaching the lesson.
And this is something that's not just in education. So Stephen Covey says, begin with the end in mind. Zig Ziglar says, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. So, it's not just an educational thing, but it really goes across all disciplines.
Have you ever walked out of a lesson or a sermon or something and go, what was that about?
Yeah.
What was that? That's the idea of you aim at nothing, you hit it every time. You walk out of there and going, man, I am still not clear on what I was supposed to get out of that.
I remember the story. Lots of times you remember this great story, but you can't quite figure out what it goes to. So it's good to have that piece of information.
Okay.
So we want you to take a minute and listen to this video. It's from the book Brain Rules. Dr. Medina is the guy on the right side of your video. But listen to what they're going to give you an example. I'm going to tell you that they're talking about something you definitely know about. So listen to what they have to say and I want to encourage you to stop when you get to the part when they get done describing it and write down what you think they're talking about and then play and see what they're talking about. I have presented this video numerous times to adults
Sure.
when we've been teaching them. I've done it with my students in class, and I have not yet had one person who could tell me what they were talking about. But after they tell you what they're talking about, you'll be like, oh yeah. If you listen to it again, you'll
It'd
understand
be so
it.
obvious.
Most of the factors that predict whether or not something that is being perceived will also be remembered operate in the first few seconds of learning. One of these factors involves something termed a schema and whether or not the new learning bumps into one. Let me show you an example of a schema by having Dr. Whitehead and myself read a paragraph to you, one actually taken from a famous research paper. Your job is to remember as many facts about the paragraph as you can. Let me tell you in advance that you are going to fail miserably at this task unless I do something first. I can instantly improve your memory score from between 50 to 100% simply by adding 7 little words before you hear Dr. Whitehead and myself. But I'm not going to do that. You will hear the paragraph first, then I will read you the words.
The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient, depending on how much there is to do.
If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many.
In the short run, this might not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well.
After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places.
Eventually, they'll be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is a part of life.
Did you get all that? No? Let us give you now the 7 magic little words. This paragraph is all about washing clothes. What that sentence provides for you is a mental framework, a way of organizing thoughts around some aspect of the world. We call such frameworks schemas, and you have them about people, situations, objects. This means something profound. Prior knowledge can disturbingly shape how you memorize and retain for long-term storage future knowledge. If a schema is triggered near the moment of learning, that learning is more permanent.
Brainers!
Well, now that they've watched the video, what's been your experience as a teacher showing this video to other classes that you've done?
So I've shown this video to lots of different people. I've shown it to adults in seminars similar to this. I've shown it to students, and I have not yet had one person who could tell me what they were talking about. When I stop the video, I always stop it, and they've not been able to tell me what they're talking about. And what I want you to think about for yourself personally is that if you come into class and you start teaching, you know what you're talking about, but your students, even if it says on your syllabus what it's going to be about that day, they more than likely might not have read it, but just think about all that good information that you have going out there, just like when these people were speaking and you were missing all of it because you were trying to figure out what they were talking about. That's what is happening with the students in your class. But if you tell them right at the beginning what it's going to be about, then
everything makes sense.
When they start listening, they can connect it. So it's that important connection piece.
So that's really one of the major reasons why you want to not only write the objective, but also communicate the objective. The other area is that students are really good about either intentionally or unintentionally getting you off track. They like to ask you some questions. Sometimes it can be about you personally, but it could be generally about the topic, but they start getting you off task. And you can come back to those kinds of things. There are techniques ways that you can go to a whiteboard or a chalkboard and put up there, this is what we call a parking lot, and we'll come back to that later. But you can re-emphasize with your students, we have a place that we're going today. And so we are not going to be going after that, unless there might be some time at the end of the class, or I can talk to you about this separately. I can email you or something, but we are going to stay focused. So another reason that you want to have the objective is so that you stay true, your lesson stays true to the objective, that the point that you're trying to reach during that session.
Exactly.
And as we've talked about not keeping it a secret, and there are just so many ways to communicate with your students.
Yeah, you
what that
might,
is.
put it up on the whiteboard in front of your class so the students know what's happening. You should say it at the
Yeah,
beginning.
at the very least, if there's just one thing that you can just make so easy, you can tell your students verbally, this is where we're going to go. It does help you have different kinds of learners in your classroom. Some are more auditorially sensitive and some are more visually. And so if you do both of those, write it and say it, read it to your students. The other reason I like it on the board is that you can refer back to it. So when a student brings up another topic, you can go back to it and say, remember, this is where we're going today. So we'll come back to that. I want to respect your questions, but I don't want to lose track of where we're headed today. So writing it and speaking it is certainly
And sometimes
really
it's
good.
hard if the class is leaving and you're coming into the class, you may not have time to write it, but if you put it on your PowerPoint, then it helps you.
there.
You start off your PowerPoint that way. When you're putting it together, keeps you on track and putting your PowerPoint together, but it also is right there and you can just read it to the class. And it'll make you remember to say it.
And all
Helps
the
me.
other elements are going to keep going back to this objective. You may have been in a lesson where, I hate to pick on Sunday school teachers. My wife probably won't appreciate this. You won't either. I know you teach Sunday school, but so often I've been in a Sunday school classroom where people are doing really nice activities, but they don't connect in any way. That's what we're trying to, it's a great pipe cleaner activity, but what does that have to do with David and Goliath? I'm not really sure. That's just, I use that as an example only because it's a nice, easy example to look at, but that's the kind of thing that we're trying to avoid. And these are the things that keep us honest and focused on the objective. You can also send your students an email prior to class or a text, whatever electronic communication that you use with them. You can send this ahead or even after class. You can also ask them to restate it. One of the things that to keep them focused, because they'll get distracted during the lesson, you can have them restate it to each other. That's the engagement piece again, where they're able to articulate what's the purpose of today's lesson.
Yeah.
And so refer to it throughout the lesson. Don't think of it as we did that, we checked that off, we did it at the beginning of the lesson, we're done. It's actually something to be a very useful tool throughout your lesson. We use this illustration of having a target. The opposite of what Zig Ziglar said, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. But if you know exactly what the bullseye is and where you're headed with the lesson, you will hit it every time. If you've planned appropriately, you've planned everything toward that, you've told the students where we're going, we're on this journey together, we're going to get to the place that you want to be.
Okay, so just like we said before, here's our closure. We'd like you to write a tweet about the value of writing lesson objectives. And this is an assignment that I would recommend that you do with your students. I've had students do it, and it's fabulous. I mean, they do amazing things. So first of all, we're going to give you that assignment to write a tweet about it, but I also want to encourage you to do it in your own class.
Don't close your lesson without some kind of a closure activity.
Right.
You want your students to exit where it's tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. It's the old basics of teaching. And that closure piece is the part where they walk out of your classroom, and again, anybody out there in the hallway you can say, what'd you guys do in Dr. Lyding's class today? And they'll be able to articulate it because you had a closure activity that wrapped that. It's like putting a bow in a package and putting all the pieces together. So don't forget closure in your lesson. Have fun writing your tweet.
Yep.